All right, tonight we are going to finish up chapter 2 of the book of Exodus. And up to this point, we've kind of seen this recurring theme of God fulfilling his promises, being active both in the bigger picture of things, of everything that's going on, and also in the day-to-day things, the things going on in life. We see that with the midwives, and even in the life of Moses' parents, and what they're doing, and in honoring God by not killing their son, or the midwives not killing the newborn babies. Yeah. And we've seen God in this. Tonight we're going to look at chapter 2, verses 11 through 25, the end of chapter 2, and there's really not a whole lot of talk about God in this, but what I want to do is kind of go over what took place, and then at the end, we're really going to be focusing in on verses 23 through 25, and what this passage shows us about God, and help us better understand who He is. So, up to this point, like I said, the Israelites have been enslaved in Egypt, and they've been going through oppression. Pharaoh was, for some reason, worried about them and has been cracking down. Started with making their jobs harder, kind of bringing them down into slavery. We see it with the genocide that he pushes forward with the midwives trying to kill the newborn babies, then the edict for all of the Egyptians to destroy any newborn male child of the Israelites. And we've seen God in it every step of the way. And last time we discussed how Moses' parents hid him for 3 months, kept him safe, and then put him in the basket, and how he was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, and all that took place, and all that had to kind of fall into place for that to happen. And we talked about how God was sovereign even in those things, that in the little obedience that Moses' parents has acted out, even the daughter, Miriam, how that all brought to culmination God's plan. And they didn't really know it. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't know what would happen, but yet they were faithful in the little things. We talked about how the book of Hebrews points back to that faith, and how Moses was spared and ultimately adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. So we're picking up in verse 11 tonight, where Moses is grown up. And so we're just going to pick up there and read down through verse 22. We'll discuss that, and then we'll dive into kind of those last verses and talk about, well, what does all this tell us about God? So in verse 11 it says, "One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, 'Why did you strike your companion?' He answered, 'Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid and thought, 'Surely the thing is known.' When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father Reuel, he said, 'How is it that you have come home so soon today?' They said, 'An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us and watered the flock.' He said to his daughters, 'Then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread.' And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, 'I have been a sojourner in a foreign land.'" So Moses is now grown up, and the first thing that we're introduced to as Moses, as kind of a full-grown man, is Moses does something pretty bad. Moses murders a guy, kills a guy. It says that when he'd grown up, he noticed one day that an Egyptian was beating a Hebrew. Now, there are probably a lot of emotions that were going through Moses' mind at this time. He probably has seen the oppression over his years of growing up and seen what has been inflicted on the Hebrews, knowing himself that he is a Hebrew. And he sympathized for this man, but in his sympathy, he commits a crime, and he kills the Egyptian and buries him in the sand. And he knew that he was doing wrong. He knew that he was committing a crime, because it says that he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So this was not just like an act of passion. It was, okay, I'm going to take care of this, checked the situation, made sure there was no one around, and then killed the guy and then hid the body. That's a pretty big deal to take the life of another individual. And here we have Moses, someone that God's going to use in a mighty way, commit this horrible crime. It goes on, it says, when he was out the next day, he meets these two Hebrews, and they're struggling together. And so he goes up to him, and he tries to break up the fight. Why did you strike him? And lo and behold, they know what he did. They know that he killed an Egyptian. And so they kind of mock him and say, who made you prince and judge over us? Are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? It shows us that Moses, while he thought he was able to hide that sin, while he was able to keep that contained, somehow it got out. Somehow someone saw it. Somehow someone found out about it. And the thing that Moses tried to hide, Moses has now been revealed that it wasn't hidden as well as he thought. So then Moses gets scared. If they know, surely Pharaoh has heard of it. Surely the thing is known. And Pharaoh does hear about it, and he seeks to have Moses alive. So what does Moses do? Moses flees from Pharaoh. He left Egypt, and he stayed in the land of Midian. Now, I think here we see another aspect of God's providence, even when things are not going well. Even when Moses has committed this sin, he's murdered this man, God was using even that to get Moses where he needed Moses to be. God didn't cause Moses to kill the man, but yet God used that to get Moses to Midian. Had that not happened, Moses would have no reason to flee. Moses wouldn't have a reason to run away from Pharaoh, and he would have stayed and remained in Egypt. Now, God could have done other things to reveal himself to Moses and to bring about the redemption of his people in Israel, but God was using this moment in Moses' life to get him to a place to where he would be ready to hear from him in the burning bush, as we'll see next week. So he flees. He runs away. In verse 16 it says, Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came down and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. So he runs away, and he ends up in Midian. He sits down at this well, and here come the 7 daughters of Reuel, and he steps in and he helps them out. The shepherds try to drive them away, but he stands up for them. He helps them water their flocks, and he's done this kind of kind act here. In this kind act that he does, this meeting, this happenstance of being at this well, he runs into these daughters of Reuel. He helps them out, And then they go back and tell their father about what takes place. And he says, bring him here. Why did you leave him? Bring him here. And he goes, and he ends up staying with him and ends up marrying one of those daughters, Zipporah. And they end up having a son named Gershom. There are a lot of big life-altering decisions being made in this chapter. Moses makes a bad decision and kills a man, then has to run for his life, and in running for his life, he ends up in Midian, and in Midian, he ends up at this well, this specific well where these daughters come, and he ends up just doing a kind act to defend them, gets invited to the family, ends up marrying one of the daughters, and has a son. Now, we can look at this at several different angles, but what I think we can see in this is that even in the normalcy of life, when Moses makes bad decisions, when Moses does good things, God is working those things together to get Moses where he wants him. I think we can say the same thing about our own lives, is that, if we look back, I'm sure there's times where we've made decisions that we weren't real proud of, things that we look back and think, man, wish I could have done that differently. But at the same time, we can also sometimes see how those decisions got us to where we needed to be. Not that it was good that we did them. Maybe it was a bad thing that we shouldn't have done. But God even used those things in our life to bring us to where he wanted us to be. And I'm sure we can look at good decisions in our life where we've done something that was good and pleasing to God, and God used that to get us where we needed to be. Moses didn't have any idea of what the future held. In his mind, he's on the run. He's never going back to Egypt. He's killed a man. There's probably a lot of emotion there. He's left not only not with his people anymore or around his people, he's in a foreign land by himself at this well, and he's just, does this kind thing of defending these women. And it just gets Moses where he needs to be. Like I said, our own lives, that if we look back, I think a lot of times if we just focus in and kind of look at all that's taken place in our lives, we can see how God has gotten us through everything and how God has guided our steps along the way. That we can say with Paul in Romans that all things work together for the good of those who love God, that in our good decisions and in our bad decisions, God can use those to put us exactly where he wants us. So we see God at work in Moses' life, kind of dialed in at that personal level. Now we're going to dial out and see kind of the bigger plan in verses 23 through 25. Verse 23, it says, "During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob, and God saw the people of Israel, and God knew." So we see, we know the picture. We know where Moses is heading, so we can look at this and we can see God in it. We can see that God was getting Moses where he needed to be in order to bring him back to Egypt to free the people from Egypt. And we also see on a grander scale from the bigger plane that God has not forgotten the Israelites. It says, during those days, the king of Egypt died. There could have been things going through the Israelites' minds at that time. The king that was oppressing them is dead. Does that now mean that the new king will maybe lighten things up? Does that now mean that the new king is going to change things and maybe will remember what Joseph did, remember what they were there for, and remember all the good things? And maybe things would lighten up and maybe the oppression would ease up. And so with this change in leadership, we can imagine that there's probably this anxiety, this angst within the people, hoping and praying that maybe there might be an even bigger change. And so this is probably not as though they just started praying again, but maybe it just brought more emphasis to their prayers now that there was that change, and maybe this was the chance. We don't know. I mean, a lot of that is speculation, but we can imagine what might be going through their heads. It says, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. They were crying out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And God heard their groaning. God knew what they were going through. God knew the situation that they were in. Further down, he says that God saw the people of Israel and God knew. He knew. He knew where they were. He knew their dire need to be rescued. And in this knowing, he also knew, it says, that God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Now, it's not as though God forgot. It's not as though God gets this prayer from the Israelites and says, you know what? I forgot all about them. But now I remember. That's not what it's communicating here. It's communicating that God had not forgotten them. It's communicating that God, one, saw the people of Israel, and God knew the people of Israel, and he knew the covenant he had made, and that plan was coming closer to bringing them out. So we see Moses struggling in what he's struggling in. We can see how God was using the struggles that were in Moses' life to get him to a place to where ultimately in chapter 3 he's going to speak to Moses in the burning bush and approach Moses about going back to Egypt to bring his people out of bondage. We see that God working in Moses' life, but we also see God knowing the situation and knowing all that's taking place and remembering, not forgetting that he had a promise that he had made and that he was going to fulfill that promise. So every step of the way as we've gone through the book of Exodus so far, these first 2 chapters, we see a God who is faithful, a God who knows, and a God who hears. A God who is transcendent over all things and has a bigger plan that he's working out, and a God that is immanent, who is in the plan, making sure it comes to fruition. That whether it was in the daily lives of the midwives, or the daily lives of Moses' parents, or whether it was in Moses' life himself, God was there every step of the way. And as we dial back and see that bigger grand plan, we see God there orchestrating it all. In control. Bringing about his plan. The plan that he had promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So as we look at this, it should give us great confidence, knowing that God is in control. That God hears his children. God knows his children. That he is immanent, that he is with us. That he is also transcendent, that he is above us and knows all things that are going on. And is above all things that are going on, is in control of all things that are going on. So in that we can find comfort, we can find peace, we can find hope, knowing that no matter what is going on in our life, we are to be faithful in the little things, knowing that in the little things God is there, enabling us to accomplish those little things, but he's also in the big things, making sure those things happen as they need to happen as well. And as we look at our world right now, we don't know what tomorrow brings. Since 2020, we have been rattled, we have been shooken out of our slumber of the status quo. And I think on a larger scale, we are beginning to realize that we're not as in control as we thought we were. But we know the one who is. You know, it's interesting. the things that you see take place have taken place over the last several years. Now, I'm not one, as you know, for signs, for reading omens, for stepping outside of Scripture to understand the world that we're living in. But I think it's also very telling that we've seen God tear down idols, destroy idols. Before COVID came, we had an earthquake. And an interesting thing happened in that earthquake out in Utah. It knocked the trumpet out of the hand of the statue on top of the Mormon temple. Now, like I said, I don't read into stuff, but I think it's interesting that you have that and you have COVID come and it shuts down everything. And the things that we idolize so much with sports, with all this, it just begins to crumble. And then when they do come back, they start pushing political junk. And more people just kind of, I don't want to put up with that. Those idols go away. We see governments and systems crumbling around us. The things that so many people put hope and their faith in just seem to be falling apart. And we can look at all that, and amidst all the chaos, we can know that we know the one in control. That all those other things, that they're just going to fall and be nothing someday. But yet God, who's in heaven, is transcendent over all those things, is over all those things, control over those things, and He will destroy all those things that stand up against Him. The Israelites had a promise through Abraham, through Isaac, and through Jacob that God would bring them out of Egypt and God would establish them in the promised land. And God accomplished that. We have a promise in Christ that God will redeem us, that He'll set us apart, sanctify us, He'll bring us and conform us to the image of His Son, and one day He'll deliver us into that promised land, our new heavens and our new earth. And He will destroy the forces of evil and completely wipe them away. We're not in the same place as the Israelites today. But in a way, we are in a similar situation. Not that we're in slavery, not that we're bound up in Egypt, but that we have a promise that God has given us. And we can hold fast to that promise and know that the same God who was at work in the little things and in the big things in the book of Exodus is the same God that's at work in the little things and the big things today. That we can rest in that comfort and know that no matter what happens, God will accomplish His purpose.